Russia's sabotage campaign against NATO countries is escalating. Is this a sign that Vladimir Putin has NATO in his sights after Ukraine? Plus, is one of the biggest funders of the Russian war machine the U.S. taxpayer? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about this bizarre story. Okay, so this is from European intelligence officials are warning that this Russian sabotage campaign is escalating. Now, for those of you that haven't been tuned in the channel for the literal 2.5 years that we've been talking about this issue, this is part of a systematic Russian effort to use their intelligence services and that intelligence services links to organized crime to conduct sabotage operations against NATO countries, particularly that are supporting Ukraine. This has included arson attacks against warehouses holding Ukrainian aid. This is attacks against vehicles, and these are definitely escalating. We talked earlier about the fact that we saw Russian agents actually attack a German armed forces base targeting German army vehicles, which is a huge escalation, something that I like to believe the United States would never stand for. But, this is the U.S. is bizarrely soft on its geopolitical rivals lately. And in this story that they profile, for example, a warehouse in East London storing equipment for Ukraine was lit ablaze by a late night arson attack. Right. And what's interesting is that this is from UK police records that say that about 30 minutes after the fire started, a man named Dylan Earl, a British citizen who admitted to organizing the arson, received a message from a man the UK authorities say was his Russian handler. Excellent, the message read in Russian. On Tuesday, a British court found 3 men guilty of arson last year, a plot the prosecutors say was masterminded by Russia's FSB, right? And so what this is it serves two efforts. First off, it is literally aiding the Russian war effort by diminishing Ukraine's ability to receive aid and resist Russian aggression. But more importantly, what it's doing is sending two messages. One is to the European public that says, listen, you guys are at risk. There is a threat to your country by your support to Ukraine, right? It sort of is the intelligence sabotage version of a Shahed drone hitting a residential building. But it's also a message to European politicians, telling them that their support to Ukraine means, or rather that the Russian intelligence services that view them as hostile for their support to Ukraine, those intelligence services can reach out and touch them anywhere. That was the message that we talked about earlier, where just a few weeks ago, where the prime minister's home of the UK's home and residence were burned in arson attacks by individuals who were linked to Russian intelligence services. 4 different, actually, European intelligence officials. Oh, check this out. Okay, the fire is one of 70 incidents linked to Russia that the Associated Press has found documented since Moscow invaded Ukraine, which is wild. That is something like 2 to 3 a month, right? That is, again, at some point you have to sit there and go, guys, is this intelligence work or is this simply acts of war? 4 European intelligence officials told AP they're worried the risk of serious injury or death is rising because, unlike, for example, the U.S. and Western intelligence services, they have a preference for using, professionals to do jobs, right? They're seen as being more disciplined, more able to do things. But Russia, a little bit like Iran, really prefers using proxies so that they can maintain a politically safe arm's distance from the actions of those proxies. But what that means is that oftentimes what's happening is the FSB is contracting out these hit jobs, so to speak, to people like Dylan Earl, right? Dylan Earl is, I would bet my bottom dollar that Dylan Earl is just a sort of low-level gangster in the UK's organized crime underground, right? Let's see if we can find him. Here we go. UK arson attack shows how Russia-linked operatives recruited gig workers for terrorism. And that's essentially who these guys are, right? Oh, God bless you, CNN. Please put it all behind a paywall. But these are individuals, again, who they describe as get a 20-year-old gig worker, right? This guy is a Gatwick airport cleaner. Just low-level people, no training, no experience, just looking to make a quick buck and not really worried about how they do it. The problem is that when you have professionals, they know how to hit the right target and not hit the wrong target. This is not the case with rando amateurs, right? As they point out here, again, this was a warehouse in a residential area of London where a nearby apartment building, residents had to evacuate in the middle of the night. And bear in mind, guys, this was a warehouse containing aid to Ukraine. But what if that aid had been artillery shells? What if it had been cruise missiles, right? This would have not been a evacuate an apartment building. This would have been a city block getting exterminated. So this kind of fast and loose game is something that the Russians just aren't worried about, right? As they say, these untrained saboteurs, these untrained amateurs under contract with the FSB start setting fire again to homes and businesses, planting explosives, even building bombs. In the last 12 months, they've seen at least one of these incidents per month that is at least known to be attributed to the Russian intelligence efforts. And again, this is what the AP can find. But bear in mind, guys, one of the things that we've seen in other known instances is that Western, and particularly the UK's MI6, their intelligence arm, they are oftentimes very cagey about disclosing when attacks have happened in order to prevent one of those attacks from achieving their objectives. So when someone sets fire to, again, a Ukraine supporter's house, for example, if intelligence believes it might be linked to Russia, they may not say that, because if they come out and publicly disclose it, then that message is going to, the FSB is going to achieve its objective of intimidating other people. So, as they point out, as the intelligence officials point out, when you start a campaign, it creates its own dynamic and it's more violent over time. For example, recently a UK court actually convicted 3 men of an arson attack, and they were actually linked to the Wagner Group. Right? This was, again, a different East London warehouse storing Starlink satellite equipment bound for Ukraine. Again, this was done at the behest of the Wagner Group, acting on behalf of Russian military intelligence. You can see these are 3 other different guys, but it's almost the same thing. Young men willing to commit small petty crimes, not really thinking things out, right? 23, 20, and 23 conducted this arson. There was a 4th man who said he was paid to drive the others, but knew nothing about the fire, possibly some sort of Uber driver. And again, there's the same individuals, right, talking about a different attack. But this is, as they point out, the MO is that Wagner used British intermediaries to recruit the men to target the industrial unit in London, where generators and Starlink equipment were being stored. The arson caused about $1 million in damage. And more importantly, I wonder if it says how much they got paid, actually. I'm trying to see if they have it. But no, I can't find anything here. Yeah, I can't see how much these guys got paid. But again, what we're talking about is really, really like petty criminals, not probably even fully realizing what they're doing when that they're being involved in an international incident, or they just don't care. Now, before we talk about the fact that some of these operations are actually being funded by your tax dollars, I want to mention that you guys know that I cover some pretty controversial issues on this channel, and part of the reason I can do so is because you guys have my back, and that's because you're members of combatvetnews.com. You guys know that members get access to the uncensored combat footage that YouTube would never in a million years let me show you. We had some absolutely crazy stuff this month, but most crazy was actually sent to me from a unit on the front line. This is probably the first time we've actually had this particular drone technology get disclosed. So if you want to see what the latest straight from the front lines drone tech that Ukraine is fielding looks like, well, you're going to have to become a member. The link is in the description. And of course, a huge thank you to all you guys that do support me. Now, we know that the Russian defense budget, keep this number in your mind, runs about 130 billion US dollars a year, right? And so where does it come from? Well, we know mostly it's oil revenues, a little bit of taxes on Russian businesses, and a little bit of Russia's foreign currency reserves and debt. But the other provider appears to be Medicare and Medicaid. That's right. The U.S. has charged 11 Russian individuals in a scheme to steal $10 billion from Medicaid. And by the way, guys, this is just one of a slew of these kind of efforts, right? Just absolutely wild stuff. So here again is just one of many, many countless Russian fraud schemes. And this, bear in mind, this is just detected, right? This is hundreds of thousands of people enrolled in Medicaid were billed for expensive medical equipment they never asked for in 2023. It was part of a $10 billion fraud scheme, one of the largest schemes in Medicare history. The scheme was carried out by 11 defendants in the United States, Estonia, and Czech Republic who worked for a criminal organization based in Russia, right? And of course, basically, it sounds like these individuals bought small companies that were accredited to submit claims to Medicare and the program's supplemental insurers. Then they, using those companies and using personal information stolen from millions of Americans, the defendants filled billions of dollars in claims for equipment that had not been ordered by people enrolled in Medicare and was never delivered to them. Right? So they stole your identity, said, man, look, we just got an order for diabetes test strips for this person. We're just going to send it to them. But then there were no diabetes test strips. It was all just a fake invoice scheme. And the result was, of course, billions of dollars of U.S. taxpayer money. All right, of the $10 billion that was fraudulently billed, the indictment says the defendants actually collected about $900 million of it, most of it coming from private Medigap insurers and the rest from the Medicare program itself. Right? The patients did not pay for the phantom supplies. You did, U.S. taxpayer. Good job. Including urinary catheters, braces, and other durable medical equipment. Such schemes, right, of course, cause premiums to rise. Now, in 2019, of course, the similar group of organized criminals defrauded $1 billion from Medicare with phony back and knee braces. Prosecutors charge 18 defendants in a $500 million scheme involving false COVID-19 test kits. So what is pretty clear, the organization, of course, moved its proceeds through shell companies in Singapore, Pakistan, Israel, and other countries, laundering it using cryptocurrency and landing it right back in Russia. Well, what does that mean? Of course, guys, as we know, that there is no business in Russia that operates without some sort of patronage to the state, official or unofficial. And so it's extremely likely that a large portion of the proceeds of this scheme, possibly more than half of it, ended up in the pockets of the Russian government. And some of those were likely oligarchs lining their pockets, right? Russian corruption, of course, knows no bounds. But almost certainly some of this went into the Russian war effort. And bear in mind, guys, that of the $136 billion that Russia spends to fuel its war machine, what we see here is that, again, up to what, almost 10% of that budget was scammed out of Medicare. And this is when you see a lot of people talk about going after fraud, waste, and abuse. I want to point this out. I want to show you guys. So when people talk about going after fraud, waste, and abuse, the professionals are actually folks with these organizations called OIGs, the Office of the Inspectors General. And these OIG folks, this is all they do. They wake up every day and find places where the money is getting misspent, wasted, or where the laws, rules, and regulations aren't being followed. So again, the story that I want you guys to get out of this is that $10 billion, by the way, guys, for those of you keeping score at home, that's literally 1/10 of all of Elon Musk's Doge efforts. And guess what? This isn't going to get overturned by a court. The court, instead of reinstating those employees or whatever, the court literally high-fived them and was like, good job, guys. Way to go. So this kind of scheme, again, this is one of my chief complaints with a lot of politicians on both sides of the aisle, is that these OIGs, I'm going to say that this scheme probably, I don't know, an OIG, HHS's OIG, I'm going to say their budget's probably maybe $100 million max. And they just recouped $10 billion from taxpayer money. If they were even able to keep half of it, the OIG would not need a budget probably for the rest of the decade. And you would think that like a business, if you ran the government like a business, you would look at who brings in revenue. And again, this didn't hurt a U.S. taxpayer. It's not like someone actually isn't going to get help that they needed. All it did is save the taxpayer money and pull funds out of a hostile actors, an enemy of the United States. It pulled funds out of their pocket and put it back in the pocket of taxpayers. And yet, even the latest budget is cutting the funding for these OIGs. Don't you think that's kind of weird? Don't you think that's like extremely sus? Anyway, that's just me. Don't worry about it. What I also want to point out is that this is also detected. This is kind of apropos of nothing. This is detected by a healthcare fraud unit data analytics team. Because what I think is fascinating about some of these, again, is that one of the ways that they detect these sort of schemes is actually because nobody knows what an individual's medical illnesses might be. But in a population, when you have 10 million people, you can predict to actually a pretty high mathematical certainty what sort of issues they are going to develop, right? And so when you start to see, let's say you had 10 million people and you suddenly saw the equivalent of ordering urinary catheters for every man, woman, and child in that population, you'd go, I think that's a clue that there's something fraudulent, because I highly doubt that every man, woman, and child in this 10 million person population suddenly is getting critical chronic UTIs or whatever. So, you know, this is the sort of thing that these analytics teams can detect. Obviously, they do it much more sophisticated. They know exactly how these orders are supposed to look and where they're supposed to go and who they're supposed to be placed with and the frequency. And you know, this is when people talk about AI saving money. Imagine if instead of having to have a whole analytics team, the government just had an AI that automatically said, hey, we're flagging this order. Somebody just ordered $50 million of diabetic test strips to one company from one doctor's office in like rural Montana. You know, the AI would go, hey, send this up to somebody to take a look at. So again, you can see that the Russians are in some ways sophisticated and in some ways comically unsophisticated. But again, to do a good fraud scheme, those of you that have ever been in anti-fraud know this, a good fraud scheme only needs to be just slightly more complex than the accountability systems. But that's not the only U.S. adversary that's stealing old taxpayer money and lining their pockets with it. We know that the other country fighting actively on Russia's side in the Ukraine war is North Korea. And guess what, guys? North Koreans always make sure to get in on the action, because for decades or nearly 8 years, North Korea has literally created fake identities for its workers and had them get jobs at U.S. companies. And then instead of that money going to American workers, it went to our enemies. That's right, guys. North Korean, part of the reason they're able to fund their military and their advanced weapons program is because hundreds of North Korean individuals fraudulently obtained deployment with U.S. companies as remote IT workers using stolen and fake identities. Of course, they were helped by folks in the U.S., China, and UAE and Taiwan, sort of tunneling in through a half dozen VPNs. And worked for 100 U.S. companies. Now, obviously, these folks did a ton of different work. In one example, for example, North Korean IT workers obtained identities, gained employment with a blockchain research and development company, and not only did they collect regular salaries, but then they went and stole cryptocurrency worth over $900,000. So this, I think, is a sign. You know, I tried to get actually a total of how much these folks earned. But what's crazy is that you see just a huge wave, right? 100 companies, including many Fortune 500 companies, hired these folks. And these damages totaled over $3 million just in computer network remediation costs, right? Because once you've had a North Korean hack into inside your network, you basically have to scrub the whole thing clean because you don't know what they could or could not have done. It's also troubling because these individuals, and here they even talk about it, stole not just money, but also remotely, once they got into these companies, were actually able to get sensitive data that is covered by what's called ITAR, which means this meant that it was IT data that was so sensitive and so related to U.S. weapons programs that it was regulated as a military, as an arm, as a weapon. And so they were able to get employed by a California-based defense contractor that develops artificial intelligence equipment and was able to steal this AI software and get it to North Korea despite it being marked as ITAR sensitive. And so the best number I could find was around $600 million a year. That was sort of the high end of the estimate, but you have to understand how insanely high that is, right? For a country like North Korea, $600 million probably represents the value of their entire contribution to the Russian war effort, right? And I can't put in context how insane this is, that this is money that should have stayed in the United States, that U.S. workers should have earned, they should have paid taxes on, they should have put it in their bank accounts, invested it back in U.S. companies through a 401k. Instead, it got siphoned off wholesale and dumped into the North Korean state, where then it literally funded soldiers who went to Russia and fought against the Ukrainians who were armed with U.S. weapons. It's like the meme, my taxpayer money, somehow also my taxpayer money. So the takeaway from this that I want you guys to have here is that, like, America's enemies, this whole well, I don't really think we should be involved in every conflict across the globe. And I actually agree with that sentiment. But America's enemies don't give us a choice. It's like going into a UFC fight. At some point, when that cage door locks and there's someone standing across the cage from you, you lose the ability to decide whether or not you're going to fight. The question becomes, are you going to win? That other person's going to hit you, just like the North Koreans are going to work tirelessly to hack American companies, steal American data, get inside America's national security infrastructure, right? They are working tirelessly to build weapons to destroy us. And so to sit there and go, well, I don't know if we should do anything about that. I don't know if we should be upset about it. At some point, you got to go, listen, it doesn't matter what I think should have happened. You go, listen, this dude's punching me. I got to punch him back. And this is the same thing with Russia. Again, we sit there and there's so much prognosticating, there's so much worrying about escalation. But why isn't Vladimir Putin worried about whether stealing billions of dollars from the United States would be seen as an escalation? Why isn't he worried about burning down warehouses, military facilities of NATO countries? Why doesn't he worry about that being an escalation? Why is it that the only the West, seems to have to defer to Vladimir Putin, and he gets to do anything he wants? It's like if your neighbor had a vicious dog. Yes, you can sit there and go, well, really, it was my fault I got bit by the dog because I was in their yard. I was wearing red. I was carrying food in my pocket. At some point, you got to go, listen, you should be able to walk around the street. You should be able to carry food in your pocket. And the fault doesn't lie with you. It lies with the dog. And that's basically how Vladimir Putin has been operating. He's the vicious dog, and he realizes that the West is going to sit there and go, really, it was my fault I got mauled by that dog because I maybe talked too loudly. Like, live in the real world, guys. It'd be nice. It'd be nice. Like I said, everybody feels like the rest of the world knows they are in a conflict with the West, except for the West itself, who just continues to make believe that we can all hold hands, and if we just sing the right songs, we can all be friends. Anyway, guys, thank you so much. Thanks to my Colonel tier members, guys like James J21, Yanko, Georgiev, Chris Gorsuch, Paul Templeton, Cytronic, Steve Moran, TR Need, Alan Knutson, CM Holmes, all of our Lieutenant tier members. I could not do it without you guys, and I hope you guys enjoyed yesterday's video, and of course, become a member, and you can catch Thursday's drop. Actually, you'll be able to watch Tuesdays too. They're all on there. It's archived. See ya. Cheers.